Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the Israeli tank formations in the game of Team Yankee. The Israeli tank formations, including the Magog 6, Merkava 1, and Merkava 2, were all introduced in the Oil Wars book, so it's been out for a hot minute, and players have had a chance to experiment, but we're going to go through and review their strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps how best to build formations around them. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at basically any Israeli unit is that the Israelis tend to have some of the best soft stats in the game, and what I mean by this is stats like courage, morale, remount, skill, etc. The only stat that Israelis tend to have a very mediocre on is the assault rating, in which they're generally about a 4+, but basically every other rating is going to be at least a 3+. This makes the Israelis pretty good at sticking around even when they're heavily depleted, and it also makes them pretty good at using various movement orders such as blitz or shoot and scoot. So it's always good to keep these in the back of your mind that these are a more viable option for you than these might be with armies with lower skill ratings of 4+ or 5+. Now, to kick things off, we're going to look at the Magog 6 tank platoon. Now, this is kind of an odd variant of the Magog, but we'll go into that a little bit later. Specifically, in terms of unit keywords, the only one you really have is infrared. This means you don't have any additional side armor against heat keywords. These would be things like ERA, BDD, bazooka skirts, etc. So you're only using your base side armor when you're hit with these infantry anti-tank weapons, which does limit these tanks pretty significantly because they only have a side armor of 8. Now, a side armor of 8, it's not the worst in the world. It can protect you from things like autocannons pretty efficiently, but most infantry units in the game are going to have very basic weapons like the M72 Law or an RPG-7 or whatever, and 8 is really not enough to consistently protect you from these weapons, especially because in an assault, getting bailed is essentially just as bad as dying. So in general, these tanks do kind of want to avoid very close range fights with infantry wherever possible. And of course, that brings us to the front armor value of 15. 15 is enough to keep a lot of the nuisance anti-tank shots out, like the AT-12-13s, and can even shrug off RPG-7s reasonably efficiently. The problem is when you start getting bigger and more powerful guns like the AT-21-23 range, that's when this armor becomes basically useless. It's purely superficial. At that point, you're leaning on the fact that you're only hit on a 4+, and that's why, to a large extent, you should be looking to keep these tanks at the longest distance possible to artificially extend your armor and to also try to get some extra range penalties going on so that the enemy just can't hit you at all. These tanks really are at their best when they're sniping at longer ranges, and we'll see that a bit when we start looking at their gun. Speaking of the gun, we have the M68 105mm. Get used to this, we're going to be seeing this gun a lot, except it's going to have some slightly different keywords added to it. This gun has a pretty solid range, but it only has a moving ROF of 1, and that's because it doesn't have a stabilizer, so this tank is a lot less effective while moving. Additionally, you do have the accurate keyword, so if you don't move, not only do you get the 2 shots for your halted ROF, but you also get, you don't get the range penalty for shooting at longer distances, so it's kind of like a poor man's laser rangefinder. You also have the brutal keyword, so you can force infantry to reroll successful saves if you hit them. So overall, this tank is really just best suited to long-range sniping in defensive positions because the accurate keyword means you're not taking penalties, you can extend the armor and the survivability a little bit more. It's really not much of a brawler, but it is a reasonably good and inexpensive way to get additional moderately high AT shots. And the tank also features a healthy suite of machine guns. You have a 50 cal, and then you have 3 total 7.62 machine guns. Now, the 7.62 machine guns brings up an interesting note because the stat card is correct, but the model is not. The stat card is representing the tank having 3 additional machine guns on top of the 50 cal, which this Magog 6 did actually have. However, the model only represents 1 of them, and that's because the model doesn't represent the loader machine gun. The Israelis like to have a commander machine gun, a loader machine gun, a coaxial machine gun, and then an overbarrel 50 cal that the gunner also operated, and the loader machine gun is not represented. If you are looking at modeling that and you're wondering what type of machine gun would be appropriate, for most of their models it would have been something like the FN Mag, so just keep that in mind. If you can't find any FN Mags lying around though, the American M60 will work fine because most people honestly probably couldn't tell the difference. Now, if you were to compare the Israeli Magog 6 to something like the American Army's M60A3s, you'll notice some pretty substantial differences. The American M60A3s have a moving ROF of 2, they have stabilizers, they have laser rangefinders, they have a better anti-tank value. Overall, just a more powerful machine, but it has slightly worse soft stats, except that the M60A3s for the American Army are only about a point more for the formation than the Israeli tanks, and this kind of leads to an awkward spot where the Magog 6s, while they're relatively efficient. They're not really the most efficient, and realistically probably could afford to go down a point or two and would probably be fine. And the formation itself is somewhat interesting because you have a mandatory 1 Magog 6 company HQ, and then you have 2 platoons of tanks. You can take an additional platoon, a mechanized infantry platoon, or some form of reconnaissance. This leads to a bit of an issue though when you're list building, because you don't really have what you would call anchor units. Anchor units are units like artillery or anti-air that can stay out of the fighting while still contributing to the fighting. They can stay out of line of sight, and they also help your formation stay in good spirits. The Magog 6 doesn't really have anything like that, and the tanks themselves aren't that hard to destroy. The closest you could really get would be a mech infantry platoon, but of course that's kind of a frontline fighting unit, and in that scenario the mech infantry platoon is actually harder to remove than the Magogs, so your opponent could just focus the Magogs and get rid of the infantry platoon without having to deal with how annoying they can be to get rid of. So the Magog 6 tanks, while they are usable as individual platoons, as a company they're just not the best option. What I would really recommend doing is looking at potentially using them as support for a mech infantry platoon, because a mech infantry platoon can take any of the 3 tank platoons we're going to talk about today as a support element, or using them as a black box. If you're not familiar with the term black box, any unit has the ability to take a black box option, such as the Magog 6 tank platoon, as a support option for their formation, and you can just only take one of them, but that's fine because all these units are really good for in terms of the Magog 6 is the one supporting fire anyway. It's also important to remember that while black boxes can be a nice versatile option to round out your force, the Israeli formations are a lot more limited, so your black box options are a tank formation, another tank formation, another tank formation, or a mechanized infantry platoon, so you don't exactly have a ton of versatility, and you're not super sad devoting one of your black boxes to just get some additional supporting fire from a tank platoon. Now, one thing I kind of hinted at earlier and that I want to kind of expand on, at least for those who are interested in the history of these vehicles, is that this is kind of an odd variant of Magog. This is a Magog 6 that is also not stabilized, but also uses the newer M60 turrets. And I suspect the reason Battlefront did this was less because it was the most historically accurate version, and more because it was the only version you could represent without adding a significant number of additional parts to the kit. What I mean by this is the original Magog 6 actually would have used the older pattern, more rounded M60 turrets. Whereas once you start getting into the newer, more elongated M60 turrets, most of those would have used Blazer or newer patterns of ERA, which would have required a lot of additional parts. The only version I can find that really used the elongated turret but hadn't quite moved to Blazer was the Magog 6A, and that didn't have a stabilizer, and that's likely why this is an unstabilized version versus one of the later stabilized versions. Which isn't crazy, it's not ahistorical, because the Israelis are well known for taking anything that can drive and shoot out of storage when the crap hits the fan, but it is kind of an interesting side note, and it would be nice to see Blazer ERA equipped M60s on the battlefield at some point. Maybe Battlefront will put out an updated kit, or maybe we'll see an update to Oil Wars. That would be pretty nice. And moving on to our next tank formations, we have the Merkava 1s and Merkava 2s. Even though these are separate tank companies, we're going to address them both in the same segment because they have a lot of similarities. It's just some minor differences in armor and keywords, so it's useful to look at them together as a singular unit. Now, it's important to realize the Merkava 1s and 2s have the same basic tank company formation as the Magog 6s. The only real difference is that now you have the Merkava 1s and 2s instead of the Magog 6s. So you still have that problem in that you don't have a good anchoring unit like a self-propelled artillery or an anti-air that can try to keep your formations around, but it turns out the Merkava 1s and 2s are a lot harder to deal with, so it's not as much of a problem when dealing with them, especially because the Merkava 1s and 2s often aren't significantly easier to get rid of than the mech platoons, unlike the Magog 6s. So the first thing you'll notice about these tanks is the keywords. The Merkava 1s have bazooka skirts, whereas the Merkava 2s have BDD armor. So this means that the Merkava 1s, when hit with a heat round in the side, will get an armor value of 10, whereas the Merkava 2s will get a 13. This is a pretty significant jump from the older model Magogs that have basically nothing and we're just relying on their side armor of 8. However, it's important to remember the side armor of both of these tanks is fairly weak. The Merkava 1 is only a 6 and the Merkava 2 is only a 7. So they are still somewhat weak to non-heat firing autocannons, but they are at least more resistant to the shoulder fired infantry weapons, or at least the smaller shoulder fired infantry weapons that you're more likely to see in an assault mode. The Merkava 2's AT-13, or side armor 13 against heat, is especially useful against common weapons like RPG-7s, because bazooka skirts can't save an RPG-7 at all. You know, you're only sidearmor 10, whereas the RPG-7 is a base 17, and that's not counting things like RPG-7 VRs. The Merkava 2 actually does have a chance of striking off these attacks. It still doesn't necessarily mean you want to charge an enemy formation that is full of RPG-7s, but if you have to, the Merkava 2 is definitely the tank you want to have over the other two options we've previously explored. Which of course brings us up to the front armor values. On the Merkava 1 it's an 18, and on the Merkava 2 it is a whopping 19. This makes Merkava 2 one of the few tanks in the game that can't even hurt itself from the front, because its gun is only AT-19, which is a useless piece of trivia but doesn't come up that much in-game. But it does kind of show one of the core issues of these tanks is that they put a lot more points into their armor than they do into their firepower, and that can lead them to getting outmatched a bit by some of the super tanks you'll occasionally see rolling around. That being said, front armor 18 and 19 is no joke. There are a lot of vehicles in the game that can't scratch it. You can run into a game against, for example, a bunch of older BMP-1s and T-62s where basically nothing in that army can reliably hurt you from the front, and the Merkavas can to an extent just kind of bully their way around the battlefield. That being said, they're a far cry from invincible, but they also don't pay a ton of points for this armor, unlike a lot of the other NATO tanks that have good armor on the front. So broadly in terms of protection, the Merkava 1s and 2s strike a fairly good balance, and that they are able to protect against a lot of common threats reasonably efficiently. Now, if we move on to ratings, there is one interesting annotation in that both of these tanks have a 2+ remount base, which is again really solid, especially when you have a tank with good armor that's more likely to get bailed than outright knocked out. The ability to consistently get back in your vehicle is really powerful on a tank like this, because it means your opponent loses a lot of efficient options to deal with them where they don't necessarily have to destroy every individual machine. And that is kind of where a lot of the Israeli tanks get a lot of their value. It is the good skill checks, the good remounts, the good morale. They tend to stick around longer, and they tend to get more use out of each individual piece of equipment, and it lets the relatively good armor of the Merkava really stand out more than it would if they had much worse ratings. The gun, however, is a lot less special. You do have an extra rate of fire while moving over the Magog 6s, and you also have a stabilizer and a laser rangefinder instead of relying on accurate, so you don't get a range penalty at any distance, and you can still shoot at full ROF, and you can even move 14 inches and still be able to shoot at your full ROF, albeit at a penalty. However, AT-19 is not really anything impressive, and you can easily run into tanks like T-80s, M1 Abrams, Leopard 2s, even new Leclercs or Challengers that you're really going to struggle with, and these tanks just can't deal with efficiently. Meanwhile, while their armor is reasonably good, those enemies can definitely hurt you back. So you end up in scenarios where you have to find an alternative solution to that type of enemy, or you just have to blitz them, and I do mean that literally. Use the blitz movement order in conjunction with using stabilizers to move as fast as possible and trying to get side shots, which of course is a lot riskier. Overall, while I do think the Merkava 1s and 2s are a fairly good tank and are actually pretty solid, the inability to hurt a lot of the stronger vehicles and the fact that you're going to have limited options for dealing with them if you are leaning heavily on these tanks can be a major hindrance if your opponent does field a platoon or two of those types of vehicles. And of course you have the same suite of machine guns and 50 cals with the Merkavas that you do have with the Magog 6, and I didn't necessarily bring this up with the Magog 6, but it is a selling point in that favor and in the favor of both the Merkavas, is that an individual tank taking 6 shots is a problem for your opponent, because even one unbailed vehicle can potentially turn back an entire assault, and 2 of them is actually very likely to do so in many instances. So your opponent has to be incredibly careful trying to assault these vehicles with infantry while any of them are left operational, which again, in conjunction with their armor, works to make them much more annoying to deal with than they would have been otherwise. Ultimately, the biggest problem with the Merkava 1 is really the Merkava 2. It turns out the Merkava 2 just upgrades its armor in so many ways that are meaningful to average threats you're likely to face, and you only do this for effectively 1 point per tank, that it's really hard to justify dropping all of that survivability to go down to the Merkava 1. In reality, it's usually a better option to simply drop one Merkava 2 rather than to downgrade your whole fleet of Merkava 2s down to Merkava 1s. So it is kind of important to keep that in mind, and if the Merkava 1 wasn't competing directly with the 2, it would be a much better tank. It's just that it is kind of competing with a vehicle that gives really meaningful bonuses for a price that isn't that high. That being said, the Merkavas on the whole are both very competitive options right now, because a lot of the meta is less powerful and more numerous enemies, and the Merkavas have almost the perfect combination of AT rating and front armor to deal with a formation of T-62s or T-55s. Those tanks are really going to have trouble scratching you, and you're not going to have trouble scratching them at any range. You can absolutely tear them to pieces. And this is very much a meta thing, because if the super tanks, the tanks with really good front armor, really good guns, were a lot more meta, the Merkavas would definitely struggle a bit. So it is important to keep that in mind in terms of like the players or the nations that you're facing on average, because I know a lot of people play with their local gaming groups more often than they go to things like tournaments. Exactly what your opponent is fielding is probably going to dictate how relevant these tanks are. If you're playing a much more casual group where everybody's using M1A1 HCs or everybody's using Leclercs or T80s, the Merkava 2s might seem like a much worse choice, whereas if you go to more of a competitive setting where you see a lot of the cheaper tanks like Leopard 1s, T-62s, the Merkava 2s might seem almost overpowered by comparison. So just kind of keep that in mind, and that there is a meta consideration about these kind of mid-range tanks. One thing I do find kind of odd, and that you do want to keep in mind in general, is that the Merkava 1s and 2s only have infrared. They don't have thermal imaging, so they're not as good at night as some of their contemporaries. This is a little odd historically, as Team Yankee right now is somewhere between early to mid-90s, where these tanks would have been retrofitted with thermal imaging, and you should also kind of see the Magog 3s start to come into production and enter service. But Team Yankee is always kind of nebulous on era anyway, so I guess we can give them a pass on that. It's just a little weird they didn't go ahead and just staple thermal imaging onto both these tanks, but it is what it is, but it's just something to keep in mind. So overall, if you are looking to put together an Israeli tank formation, the Merkava 2 is probably going to be the pick most people go for, because that's the tank that it's easiest to lean on as the foundation of your army. And a Merkava 2 platoon with an HQ of 2 tanks, 2 platoons of 3 tanks each, and then a mech infantry platoon is a very difficult unit to shift, because you have a lot of tough units that don't like to fail morale and do generally like to rally and remount. The Merkava 1s can also do the same thing, but as I said, it's just the cost trade-off just kind of isn't there for the Merkava 1s right now, but they do function in a very similar capacity. The Magog 6s, on the other hand, just don't have a formation that's difficult to shift and work better as black box options or directly as support options for mechanized infantry platoons than they do necessarily as their own independent company. But the Magog 6s are a cheap way to get some extra AT-19 shots without having to dip into allied formations, so they at least do serve a purpose. And to close this video off, we're going to look at some vehicle markings so you can help make your vehicles look at least somewhat more authentic. Now, the first thing to note is the barrel bands, the white bands around the barrel. There are going to be 1, 2, or 3 of them, indicating that it is part of the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd battalion. Because it's a battalion level marking, then all of the vehicles in your formation should have the same one. Next up, you have the company markings, which are the chevrons. The chevrons will point either down, forward, or up to indicate what company they're with. Now, obviously, depending on how many companies of vehicles you have in your formation, you might have different markings, or they might have the same markings. It kind of just depends. Now, when you start getting into the letters and numbers on the turret, it's important to remember that you're looking at the Hebrew alphabet. So even though it says letter then number, it should actually be read the other way, because Hebrew is read right to left instead of left to right. So that's why you see the letter and then you see the number after it, even though it's kind of supposed to be going the other way around. It's supposed to be platoon, which is the number, and then vehicle, which is the letter. Now, the platoons go 1, 2, or 3, and the vehicles generally also go 1, 2, or 3, at least for the era of Team Yankee. There are some earlier and later eras where this gets a little fuzzy and they change up how their tanks are oriented, but for the purposes of Team Yankee, there are generally 3 vehicles to a platoon, 3 platoons to a company. Now, one other minor thing to note is you'll see a lot of Israeli vehicles running around with only the letter or only the number. This is what I like to call the Hey You principle, is that if you have to get in touch with a tank formation relatively quickly, you're going to get on the radio and call the commander of that formation. So you're not going to call the individual tank in 1st platoon, you're going to call 1st platoon's commander, and the commander doesn't need to know what their own tank is. So this is why you'll see a lot of command tanks will have truncated markings where it'll just tell you it's of the 1st platoon, because if you need to find a tank in the 1st platoon, you're just going to call that tank anyway. So it's important to kind of keep this in mind when you're looking at company commanders or battalion commanders, things like that, that they might have different markings than the rest of the formation, just because they don't need to know what their own tank is, if that makes any sense. And that concludes our video on the Israeli tank formations. Now, if you do like this content, make sure to let me know. I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to invest into these and how regularly I'm going to be able to put out videos, but the more people like and subscribe, the more I'll take it into consideration, and the more I'll try to prioritize getting more videos out of this type. And as you've probably noticed, this channel is new. I do have another channel I maintain that mostly focuses on War Thunder stuff, as you can probably tell from the background footage. If you do want to learn more about Merkavas and Magoks, I have literally entire video series on them covering every version in the game of War Thunder, and spoiler, those aren't even all the versions there are, so feel free to check that out. But I am just experimenting with this new channel, so any feedback is always appreciated. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun. Have a nice day, everybody.